Professor Willoughby, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here.
Well, we are familiar with each other. We've met in past incarnations of broadcasts, and it is great to see you again. But for our listeners, can you just briefly introduce yourself? Because we don't like to be stereotypical here, but you don't necessarily look like the average Pansori singer that you normally think of.
Sometimes I look in the mirror and I think, oh, I forgot I'm not Korean. I'm definitely not, but at least by birth. But I always say that my heart is Korean. So I was first introduced to... Sorry, did you want me to go into Pansori now, or do you just want me to introduce myself?
You can just keep going on. We'll probably edit it.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Usually I'm fine with this. All right. So I've been in Korea for a long time. I actually first came to Korea in 1986.
Wow.
And lived here for about a year and a half. And then I came back to do my dissertation research about Pansori in the late 90s and early 2000. And then I started working at IWA in 2004. So I've been here for another 13, 14 years.
That is an amazing, I suppose, kind of journey that you've been on. But a lot of people would, of course, naturally come to the question, why Korea and why Pansori?
Exactly. Well, when I first came to Korea in the 1980s, I heard a performance by Kim So-hee, who was at the time and in many ways still is one of the most famous Pansori singers. And I'd been interested in music all my life. I've been to concerts all of my life. But when I heard Pansori, I thought, I've never heard, never seen anything like this. And it just really blew me away. And from that time forward, I had a keen interest in it. I never knew that I would come back, much later and actually study it as an academic genre. But certainly it hooked me from the very beginning.
And just maybe not too technically, but what about Pansori do you think is so attractive?
There's a lot of things for me personally, but that I think attract people in general. So, as you mentioned before, it's a narrative storytelling genre, but there's a lot more to it. And sometimes the simple actions of the solo performer can be very interesting, just the way they open their fan or close their fan.
Right.
But to me, one of the things that I think is so fascinating is whether you understand the lyrics or not, there is this ability of the performers to convey emotion that I think really resonates with everybody, because the stories, they can be quite long, but in the midst of the stories, you go through the entire gamut of emotion and experience. And I think, as I said, even if you can't understand the words, people understand what's being conveyed, and they're drawn into that. And it's good entertainment. I have always told my family about it and how much I love it. But one time my mother was visiting, and I took her to a live performance, and she said, I understand now. She says, I've listened to this for many years, and I will admit I didn't really love it. But when I saw it live, she said, I understand.
So ironically, most of my musical training has been in Western classical music.
Yes.
If you put a comparison and contrast on, let's say, Gregorian chant, or in an opera, you have a recitative, which sort of brings forward the narration before the big arias or ensemble pieces. Would you say then Pansori is a bit different from that? It's a bit more emotive. It has a bit more richer texture than what I just mentioned? Right.
So a lot of people like to call Pansori Korea's opera, but I think that connotes or makes an expectation that's not going to be met.
Because the structure is so different, right?
Right. There's not a big stage. There's not costumes, except for just the hanbok, the traditional clothing and all. But as you said, there's basically three parts, or four, importantly. There's the singer that's going to sing and then do the recitative that you talked about that brings the story along. And then these simple physical actions, and then the drummer is doing the rhythms, but also calling out words of encouragement. And so within that, I think in opera, and I love Western opera, by the way, but sometimes you can get lost in the bigness of it and looking for that next amazing stage, and what are they going to do?
How are they going to hit the high C, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And in Pansori, you're not going to find that. The melodies are relatively simple in some ways
Sure.
compared to Western operas and all. You don't have coloratures, you know, going off on 500 notes on one syllable or something. But again, I think a great Pansori artist is able to connect with the audience and draw them into the story, one that for Koreans is going to be familiar and yet make it new every time. And again, to me, it's that emotional connection.
Speaking of that connection, and forgive me for putting you on the spot, but I think this would be a huge treat for myself personally, as well as for our audience, if we could perhaps get a little sample of what we're talking about right now.
All right. So I don't have a drummer here with me, and it's been a little while since I've sung, but I'm going to sing just a brief portion of the story of Joonyoung, which is a love story between a young man and woman. And this is when Lee Do-ryung or Lee Myung-yong first sees Joonyoung at a distance, and he basically wants his servant to go and fetch her. And this is what happens here. And so this is actually about the servant going. 펑! 자, 분분 듣고 춘향 부르러 건너간다. 맵시 있는 처방자, 대독혼 처방자, 얀잎 봉지 눌러 쓰고 충충 고르고 건너갈제. 초약도 도푹 쥐어 양귀 앉은 척괴거리 특저후여. 전알려 보고 소왕모 요지 안에 편지 천둥 종족같이 이리저리 건너가 준영 추천하는 것 바르드드드 타려드려 안하였다 춘영아. Thank you.
So when I hear it, I'm just 3 feet away from you. Obviously, there is that connection that you're talking about, and you said your mom kind of grasped that when she actually saw it live and saw and felt it in person. Just, again, I don't want to geek out too much, but in terms of the vocal technique, and a lot of people make kind of a lot of comments about how the techniques are different. And again, from someone with a Western trained background, and you talk about the passaggio or moving into the falsetto.
Right.
This seems really more kind of a chesty, throaty type of technique that is difficult to perfect, right?
Right, definitely. I think especially for a Westerner, getting that sound is very difficult. At least it was for me, and I'm certainly not saying that I perfected it or even come close. But you're right, it's a chest voice, and so there's a lot of pressure coming from the diaphragm of just pushing up, and there's enormous pressure on the vocal cords. And so traditionally, I don't think it's done so much now, but traditionally the performers were said to have sung in front of waterfalls or out in nature because they needed this really big, strong voice because, of course, when it first came about, there's no microphones.
Sure.
They're in an open market where cows are walking past and people, and so they had to have that projection. But it's also said of the past too that they would sing until their vocal cords would bleed and they would build calluses. And that's exactly the opposite of what a Western singer wants to do, whether they're a pop singer or an opera singer. You just do not want to try to, I won't say damage because in Korean that's the aesthetic, but to create this really raspy, harsh sound.
And it is, I guess that does imply then, of course, that a long 40-year career in doing this is a challenge, certainly. The technical aspects aside, and again, you gave your example of your mom and even an example of myself being of Korean ethnicity, but being brought up in a Western background, especially with music, it is sometimes inaccessible, maybe the wider genre of kugak, but also with Pansori, where you feel, I don't know if I get this, I don't know if I really understand this or enjoy it. You feel that Pansori can actually have a global appeal. Can you kind of articulate on that?
Well, I hope so. There's people doing different types of things to try to bring it to the Korean or non-Korean audience, both here in Korea and abroad. And so the first thing is just exposure. Just let people hear it and see what they think, whether, again, they understand it or not. The second is to have translations of the lyrics. I will say, though, just as an aside, that a lot of the language is very old. So even Koreans fluent in Korean are not going to understand all of the text. A lot of it's old Chinese poetry, and so not everybody understands it, but obviously a Korean's going to get the main stories. But I think that can be conveyed in different ways, whether some performers are, again, having translations, or they'll have the story maybe visually behind them and some sort of animation. And then there are a couple performers, Chan Park being most notable, who's a professor in the United States. And what she does is she does all of the narration portion in English and then the singing in Korean. And personally, I think it's brilliant because the audience then understands the story but can appreciate the song for what they are.
And it really does sort of depend on these bilingual professionals like yourself, like Professor Chan Park, as you mentioned. And we have the technology to do now because opera wasn't always accessible. You had to geek out and read an entire libretto and know it. Or if you now have a stage, you have the subtitles coming out. And a lot of people just know some of these standardized repertoires of these famous operas. So maybe Pansori can kind of move in that direction. What do you think your goals will be then? Obviously, you're a tenured professor. You're continuing your career as an educator, but also as someone who wants to see this art form be more widely recognized.
Right. Well, again, I think there's a couple things. The one other thing that I will add for performances is that there's a lot of collaboration now between jazz musicians or rock musicians. And so it's also this fusion or new music is coming about as well. And so a lot of singers are doing really new, fantastic things as well. But I'm sort of a traditionalist, and so for me, I would like to see traditional Pansori being shown as well as these kind of new versions of it. But my role is to do things like this. In my classes, even if I'm not teaching a music class, if it's a culture class or anything else, I always use examples for Pansori. For me, any day that I can talk about Pansori is a really good day. And so I share a lot with that, but also just trying to I have some friends who are artists, and so I suggest that whether they're having shows here in Korea or abroad, that we bring in a Pansori singer when they have their opening for their shows. And so for me to continue writing about Pansori, but also to ensure that it's being performed abroad. And if I can bring some performers abroad and help them share this art, then I will absolutely keep trying to do that.
Well, that's great. And we do hope in our own very small, humble way with our international audience that it goes a little ways towards spreading that awareness. Professor Willoughby, we are out of time, but thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we can have you back on again as this art form continues to grow.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.